Welcome from London to this second Anglo-Omani Society Zoom webinar. I'm Richard Muir, Vice President of the Society and a former ambassador in Muscat, and I'm joined today by three distinguished panelists. Abdullah Baabood, who's speaking to us from Singapore, Anoush Ehteshami in Durham, and Helen Lackner in Oxford. Our topic today is Oman's foreign policy, a forward look. We're almost 6 months on now from the accession of Sultan Haitham on the 11th of January and his inaugural speech that day, in which he pledged to trace the course of the late Sultan, reaffirming the fundamentals of our country's foreign policy. Our speakers will consider how this is being done in current and possible future circumstances. They're all very well qualified to do so, and as regular speakers to the Society require little introduction from me, but I'll just say a few words anyway about each. Abdullah Baabood is currently a visiting professor at the Middle East Institute, National University of Singapore. He's previously held the positions of Director of Gulf Studies Centre at Qatar University and of Director of the Gulf Research Centre, Cambridge. Today, he's looking at Oman's relations with the other Gulf states and with Iran. Anoush Ehteshami is Professor of International Relations in the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. He's also the Nasser Mohammed Al-Sabah Chair in International Relations and Director of the Institute for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at Durham. He'll be covering Oman and the major outside powers, US, China, Russia, the EU, and of course the UK, global Britain. Helen Lackner has worked in all parts of Yemen since the 1970s. She has written and lectured extensively about the country's political economy as well as social issues. She was winner of the 2018 Grand Prix de la Recherche section of the Grand Prix of Literary Associations and was the Luce Fellow at Durham University in 2016. Helen will be talking about Oman and Yemen. And I should note that her podcast of 12th March on the situation in Yemen is still available on the Society's website. A lot of useful background material there. And this webinar too, we shall be recording. Each of our panelists will give a 10-minute presentation and we'll then go to questions for the rest of the hour. You can put questions to us using the Q&A function on the bar at the bottom of your screen, and that'll open a box in which you can type your questions. So I will now ask Abdullah Baabood to give us his presentation. Abdullah. Sound.
Right, I have to unmute myself. Forgot to do that. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Richard, and good evening wherever you are, or good morning. It's a real pleasure to be invited by the Anglo-Omani Society to speak on this topic, and I'm also very pleased to have my co-panelists and meet them here and meet the attendees as well. I've been asked to speak on Oman Gulf relations, as it were, and I think what I would do is start with talking about how does Oman see itself in the region and how does it see its relationship with regional countries in the Gulf, and that is, the GCC, including Iran. Well, to begin with, I think I ought to say that, as you know, Oman, as many of you know, Oman has always been following an independent, neutral, unique, pragmatic policy in the region. And that stems from the fundamentals of Oman as a country, its geostrategic locations, it's the distinct culture, the unique history of the country and its trade maritime route, its cosmopolitan society, as well as its strategic considerations of Oman, and of course, its population, its economy. All of these kind of coalesce together to produce this unique foreign policy that Oman has been following. Now, Oman, as you know, is a member of the Gulf Cooperation Council that was initiated or formed in the 1980s because of the Iran-Iraq war and Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and other issues. However, before Oman decided or Oman joined the Gulf Cooperation Council, I think we have to remember that Oman had called for a regional security or regional cooperation. And Oman's view at that time that the region's security and stability should be the responsibility of all the countries in the region. It has to be comprehensive and inclusive. And that at that time, and Oman's view included Iran, Iraq, and even Yemen. And I think there was a meeting that was held in Muscat where the leaders of these countries were invited by the late Sultan Qaboos. However, that idea did not materialize because of the revolution that happened in Iran and because of the Iran-Iraq war, etc. And the Iran-Iraq war pushed the Gulf states, at least the Arab side of the Gulf states, to form the GCC, which Oman became a founding member of. Now, the GCC was meant to create cooperation, integration between the Gulf states and the Arab Gulf states, and also to find ways to help, the economies of these smaller countries to integrate together and make a larger economy and coordinate their foreign policies and defense policy. And the idea was it will be an organization that will bring in peace and prosperity and security and stability to the region. As you know, that GCC currently is not going well for the reasons that I think known to many people, and particularly because of the crisis with Qatar, and the GCC mechanism is not working and either resolving the situation or also improving the lot of the region, especially at a time when we are faced with the double whammy of bad effect of coronavirus and also the fall in the oil prices. Now, this is like just a quick overview of the history, if you like, of Oman. But Oman's foreign policy basically stems from also its belief, its real belief that its national interest is best served by having the region living in peace and prosperity and security, and this could be achieved through cooperation between all the member states of the region. Not just necessarily the GCC, but the GCC and its neighbors. And Oman has maintained good relationship with all, of course, its partners in the GCC, but also it managed to maintain good relationship with Iraq, and it's also maintained good relationship with Iran, and has always followed this neutral stand that believes that, based on its national interest, that that is based on non-interference in internal politics of the countries, based on respecting neighborly relations, respecting international norms and international law, and basically trying to resolve conflicts through dialogue and through negotiations. And in most cases, Oman's style is to have a quiet dialogue rather than, a loud dialogue that other countries like to do. So the current crisis in the Gulf and the GCC, within the GCC itself, and also within some of the GCC member states and Iran, and also the problems in Iraq, get us to think now about whether the GCC was actually the right mechanism for the region. I'm not saying that it had done a good job and it could have done better, and it could still continue as a regional organization if we can find ways to resolve the internal conflict within the GCC. But it is actually surprising that in a region that is plagued by instability, by conflict, that we do not have a much more comprehensive and more inclusive organization. Not necessarily to do with what is there and to get rid of them, but to build on that. Either to increase the membership of the GCC to other regional countries, or to have another mechanism that is much more wider and includes other players in the region. Obviously, any peace, any security, any stability in the region cannot happen with having two large countries, or three, if you like, outside this kind of a mechanism. And in this case, I'm talking about Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. What happens in those countries actually affects us all. And the misunderstanding that is happening between some of the GCC states and these countries affect the whole region. And I think we have to also learn from other regional organizations or other regions that have themselves been able to build other mechanisms on top of what is there. For example, the EU has organizations. You have EFTA, you have the EU, you have the organization OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I think what the region really needs is something like that, that is much more inclusive, that we can that can build on confidence building measures, it can build on and work on creating, if you like, dialogue between these countries. I know, Richard, you're looking at me and you want me to end here, but I'll just like to say that the current policy that Sultan Haitham is following, as you correctly said, it builds upon the previous policy that Sultan Qaboos has started. And this is based on the fundamentals of Oman's national interests and Oman's culture and Oman's belief and Oman's strategic location. And I don't think this is going to change. It might have different ways of doing it, but I think the fundamentals will be there, that Oman would want to have good neighborly relations with all the countries in the region, including Iran, Iraq, Yemen, and beyond. And I think this is what Oman likes to do, wants to do, and I think it should be helped to be able to do that. And I think the neighbors in the Gulf states should go beyond, the parochial positions of us against them, or we are one group and the others is another, to find a much more mutual organization or mechanism that is much more comprehensive, that includes all the players in the region. And of course, we cannot sort out all the issues because we have border issues, we have religious issues, we have sectarian issues. But if we have a mechanism whereby these things can be managed, then there will be a hope that all these differences can be overcome through this kind of an organization. And I think with that positive note, I would stop here and happy to get some questions later on. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed, Abdullah. Well, we'll now move over to Anoush.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a pleasure to be with you and so thank you for the invitation, and also to the society as well. By my reckoning, there are about 90 of us in that lovely lecture hall in London. So it's very nice to be amongst Oman lovers all around the world. As you said, I'll be speaking about Oman's relations with the wider world. I'll whiz through these as quickly as I can. The agendas are long, but I'll keep them as pithy as possible. I think, Richard, that Oman is at the center of three major transitions. The first is political transition at home that Abdullah has already alluded to, he's touched on. The second is systemic shift and the transition in role, presence, and influence of major powers in the region. And the third is disruption in Anglo-European relations, which has an economic, a political, and security dimensions to it. Sultan Haitham has to deal with all these three things simultaneously at a time when COVID-19 continues to be a danger for Omani society, and also at the same time to manage to digest the economic impact of COVID-19 and this slowdown in global economic activity, which has a very direct impact on Oman's economy. These crises have come at the worst time in Oman's economic transition to move away from hydrocarbons towards the more sustainable economic model. And yet it is now challenged not just on the basis of the political transitions taking place, but also on the economic transitions taking place as well. I agree with Abdullah. I think Sultan Haitham's policy is to continue with the late Sultan Qaboos's strategy of dialogue and good citizenship. But obviously, he will need to build on the relationships that Sultan Qaboos had created over half a century of intimate contact with power players around the world. With the US, this is actually, with Britain, is the second of the oldest relationship that Oman has had with the Western world, and has endured remarkably well over the decades, and indeed over a century. What are the key elements of this? I think the most important, as far as Oman is concerned, is probably the Oman-US Free Trade Agreement. Oman was one of the first partners in what the US was pushing at the time, but is now suffering as a consequence of the steel and aluminium tariffs that President Trump has introduced. And he'll suffer indirectly also, of course, because its diversification strategy depends on non-American firms investing in Oman and exporting these resources to the region and beyond. The second is the 2019, the Strategic Framework Agreement, which centers around DOM. DOM will keep coming up in my presentation because it seems to be the jewel in the crown of Oman's regional networks. The base access agreement is very significant for the US if it plans to begin to focus on what is now called as the Indo-Pacific region, in which it begins to look at China coming out of the South China Sea and becoming much more of a player in the Indian Ocean as well. The US turns to Oman as a trusted mediator. Before President Rouhani was elected to office, Oman had facilitated a conversation between the US and Ahmadinejad, who forgets Ahmadinejad's position on the region. And yet Oman was crucial in getting that dialogue between the two parties, to an extent that once Rouhani was in power, it was very easy for Americans and Iranians to begin to negotiate on the basis of trust that Muscat had already built. The mediator role that Oman plays, we have the photograph of the late Sultan and Netanyahu in Muscat on many publications, including Professor Jones, who may be with us, who's co-authored an excellent book on Israeli Gulf relations. There's another report coming out tomorrow from Atlantic Council on the same thing, and it has that very photograph on it. That was symbolic of Oman's independence, but also willingness to negotiate. It's remarkable how Oman has managed to avoid political colors in its relationships. It doesn't care whether a leader is regarded as right-wing, left-wing, centrist, moderate, liberal, Democrat. Oman maintains this very extraordinary ability to have a dialogue with all political colors. And it was significant that one of Sultan Qaboos' last acts was to host Netanyahu in Muscat. And thirdly, of course, as Abdullah has talked about, US also looks to Oman to try and address the GCC rift as well. And in that, of course, the region listens to Muscat's position. However, there are tensions between Muscat and Washington relations, and there are primarily over two actors. One is over Iran, where Oman maintains close and friendly relations with the country, and the other is with China. If there are no tensions between the US and China, I don't think US would worry about it so much. But as these tensions are present and likely to rise going forward, Oman finds itself in a slightly difficult and precarious position in that regard. It is also a major purchaser of American arms, having shifted some of its emphasis from Britain to the US. It is an important anti-IS, anti-terrorism partner in that as well. But in many ways, the historic relations between the two countries seem to have kept the parties maintaining a close balance. UK-Oman relations, this one really is built on history and mutual respect. The late Sultan, as you know, as everybody knows, had very close links with Britain. Sultan Haitham has had family serving in their embassy in London, but he's not as closely knitted to the fabric of British Anglo-Omani society relations as Sultan Qaboos might have been. But nevertheless, there are a number of drivers that keeps the two parties together. The important one, as far as Britain is concerned, of course, is the major military partnership, where Britain now has access to Dohom. It will have, in due course, a permanent military presence alongside the US in Dohom. The importance of this is that it will give British nuclear submarines, and when the aircraft carriers are in service, access to Omani waters and Omani bases for refurbishment, for brakes, and for transition as well. Britain continues to be a major supplier of weapons to Oman. The Joint Defence Agreement reinforces that. There is intelligence cooperation, as we know as well, driven through the GCHQ. Economic cooperation has been growing, but Britain's focus has been on the energy sector in Oman. And of course, with Brexit, Britain wants to build these global relationships, as you said yourself in your opening remarks, Richard. And in that regard, it'll be Britain looking to Oman to maintain these close ties with the country and continue to provide it access, particularly to Asia. And in that, Oman, I think, is very well placed. On China, Dohom and the Belt and Road Initiative again take center stage. China is investing many billions of dollars in Dohom, and it's not just about access. China is building infrastructure, industry in Dohom, and for that, Oman is going to be extremely appreciative. Also, till recently, the Chinese have been looking at Dohom as providing this foundation in the relations running across Asia right into Europe. So if you think about the China-Oman-Europe relationship, Dohom would have been a central link in that. In that, though, Oman is likely to find competition from Iran, from Kuwait, and from the UAE, the three of which are now positioning themselves as being this key link in this chain that China is beginning to build. Whether Dohom will also be the pearl in China's string of pearls military strategy in the Indian Ocean remains an open question, but Western countries with relations with Oman are concerned about this, obviously. Now, China is happy that relations between Oman and Iran are close and cordial, but China worries about intra-GCC tensions and whether Oman is exposed to pressure from Saudi Arabia and the UAE with regard to those issues. Next, Russia. This actually speaks very much to what Abdullah was talking about, the need for regional security frameworks, because actually when Russia launched its own regional security framework back in July 2019 at the UN, it looked to Oman as being one of the sympathetic listeners to that proposal. And the other party that it turned to was Iran. So in many ways, Russia is looking at these two key actors in this region to try and push this agenda of regional dialogue forward. And in many ways, I would argue Oman is much better place in that than Iran is in trying to make this as comprehensive and cross-regional as possible. But also, the Russians are looking to Muscat as a mediator. Oman never severed links with Syria once the civil war started, and has continued to maintain some kind of an understanding with Bashar al-Assad, and for that it's taken a lot of flack from its Arab neighbors. Over Yemen, Oman refuses to take arms against the Houthis, keeps its border open. I'm sure Helen speaks a lot more to this than I, but has offered itself its good offices as a mediator. Also, with regard to Iran, Oman continues to provide an opportunity that Russia would like to explore as it takes forward, in particular, this regional security framework. Now, whether Oman will be able to manage Russian-Western tensions, whether the West will respond positively to Russia's overtures, is a completely open question. Instead of finally talking about EU, I want to bring into the frame India. I think India is a very important country for Oman. For India, Oman is a strategic partner. It's Oman's third largest economic partner. There are 700,000 Indians in Oman, occupying a huge range of employment professionals and skilled workers. Oman needs good relations with India. Indian companies, about 3,000 of them, are already active in Dohum, using this as a free enterprise zone. And of course, Oman has given India maritime access as well. And it's interesting that for all its military links with the Western countries, the only country that all three services have training links with is actually with India, and no other country. For India, this is important. For Oman, this is important. And this joint defense cooperation is building on existing close ties. Conclusion, Richard, Oman is trying to be all things to all partners, and has managed to do this. But it needs to continue to balance relations with competing regional powers. I'm sure Tehran wasn't so pleased to see Netanyahu in Muscat. It has to continue to balance relations at the global level, in particular tensions between India and China, and between United States and China. It'll have to maintain its pro-Western orientation while avoiding major competition in the Middle East and Indo-Pacific region. It'll need to keep its relations with China close, and also its relations with India closer. And finally, it needs to be a standby if and when Russia's proposal for regional security framework actually does take off. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Anoush. That was an excellent survey in pretty well within the time limit. And you've also, as a bonus, answered already one question from one of our panelists. We're going to move on now to, from one of our audience, we're going to move on now to Helen Lackner. Her audio, when we tried it earlier, was not too good. So we hope you will bear with her, because she has some very interesting things to say about Oman and Yemen. Helen.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for being on this panel of, I think I dare to say, friends. I want to try and be as brief, and I think both Anoush and Abdullah have really set the scene very clearly for many of the aspects that I will cover. But I'm really going to go from the macro to the micro, in the sense that I will only talk about one country. And very briefly, I think, to remind the audience members who are not totally familiar with Yemen, I just want to give a very short introduction on the current situation in Yemen. We're now in a war that is in its 6th year, that is in no way getting any less. It's getting worse. If anything, those characteristics are changing. After a long stalemate, the Houthis have been making significant progress, and they are increasingly demonstrating their strength, which has an important impact on the situation. The anti-Houthi front and the internationally supported anti-Houthi front is increasingly divided. The sets of negotiations which have taken place in 2016, 2018 are now basically what little they ever achieved is currently unraveling. And finally, as I think probably most people have come across that fact, the humanitarian situation is an absolute disaster and is getting much worse with COVID-19. So with this very, very sketchy description, I want to move on to the situation with Oman. I think, as Abdullah and Anoush have both pointed out, that Oman's history and efforts throughout have been to be neutral, to be a mediator, to try and solve conflicts. In the Yemen case, if we go back to the early days of the Republic of Yemen, Sultan Qaboos visited Sana'a in 1993, primarily in an effort to prevent what was the civil war of 1994, and then stayed neutral when the war took place. At a more general level, the close cultural and historical relations between parts of Yemen, and particularly Al-Mahra, and between Al-Mahra and Dhofar, there's very considerable similarity in culture. There's even a common language and different ways of living, which are somewhat different from northern Oman or somewhat different from other parts of Yemen. In the recent years, Oman has been very active in helping the release of hostages from a different set of countries in different circumstances. And as has been pointed out very clearly, Oman has successfully retained very good relations with Iran throughout all the regimes. It started in the days of the Shah and it has gone on with the current situation. So very significant changes. At another level, and I think looking at points that were not looked at, there's been tensions between Oman and other neighboring states, again in the last few decades. Tensions with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The loudest one was the Buhaimi Oasis one, but there are still difficulties. And nowadays, one of the difficulties of the relations are particularly with Saudi Arabia, but also with the UAE, concerning their involvement in Al-Mahra in Yemen and other aspects. So I think, again, I'll repeat what Abdullah already said, which is that Oman is the only member of the Gulf Cooperation Council which did not participate in the anti-Houthi coalition. Admittedly, Qatar is also out, but they were basically kicked out in 2017. And also, Oman has been throughout the decades, and far more intensely now with the war, been very active in providing humanitarian aid and particularly medical aid and assisting Omanis to travel. Assisting Yemenis to travel. As we know, most Yemenis find it extremely difficult to travel in and out of the country, and Oman is facilitating this for those who choose to go through the 2,000 kilometers of and numerous checkpoints between Sana'a and Western Oman, all the way to Safid or to Béthioul. So these are all aspects that are, very relevant for Yemenis. In terms of the mediation efforts during the war, again, Oman's neutrality and non-involvement in the coalition has made it possible for Oman to be seen as a very positive element, and indeed the only positive potential mediator in the crisis by many parties. The Omanis have influence on the Houthis. They facilitate Houthi travel, which has been a major issue. They have a major Houthi delegation sitting in Muscat who are therefore able to negotiate with all and sundry who come. It's only in the last couple of days that the Omanis tried to help and persuade the Houthis to meet the special envoy, who they didn't want to meet for various reasons. I'm not sure if they succeeded, but at least they tried. And, the Omani's good relations with Iran are obviously a major asset in terms of being seen as good mediators on the part of the Houthis. So I think that's one important element. Another element, we have to look at some of the tensions. When I mentioned the tensions with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they've been manifested, if not focused, they've been manifested through accusations that Oman has facilitated the transit of weaponry from Iran to the Houthis. And I think that is very much more of an element of both anti-Houthi and anti-Iran, but particularly a sort of, I'd say, a snide way to try and accuse Oman. The likelihood is that what little is going through, and my understanding is that what goes through are small items of highly advanced technology. First, they're mostly coming in through the sea, and secondly, once they get to Yemen or the far east of Yemen, they still have the hundreds of checkpoints I just mentioned before they get to Houthi land. So one has to ask questions about who is allowing all this stuff to go through and under what conditions. I think that's, but it is used as an instrument against the Omanis. There's a lot of talk these days of Omani alliance with Qatar and Turkey as accusations rather than potentially considering these as options and assistance to facilitate reaching a solution. So I would like to, I think I'm speaking well into time, Richard, I do hope so. Anyway, there's a number of concerns that I want to raise. I think both Abdullah and Anoush have pointed out very clearly that Sultan Haitham intends to continue the neutral and independent political position of Oman that Sultan Qaboos successfully maintained for half a century. But I think, we have to look at the difficulties that he has to face in this context, because, as was pointed out, he has come to power at a particularly difficult time. And, Oman has a deep economic crisis, is deeply in need of financial support. And this is the kind of issue on which the Saudis and the Emiratis and others can put considerable pressure. And certainly, I'm sure I myself and many, many others are hoping that the Omanis successfully manage to evade this pressure and could manage to continue with this policy. But it is a very serious immediate risk. And so although the Saudis and the Emiratis have clear differences in their policies on Yemen, again, something which we can discuss later or on some other occasion, it's not particularly relevant now, is that both of them want Oman to be far more compliant and far more doing exactly what they want, which is what they basically are hoping to turn the GCC or what's left of it into something that they manage. And again, for the same reasons, I think it's very important that Oman be assisted and helped to resist these pressures and retain its independence. I think Anoush spoke in detail about the US support for Oman, and certainly, they are very important assets, but at the same time, it's difficult to imagine that in the current Trumpian age, the US are that happy about Omani relations with Iran. So, the extent to which Oman can obtain the kind of support it might need at the moment, or particularly, say, in resisting other pressures, I think it's very debatable. I want to conclude by saying that for Yemen, Oman has a unique and an incredibly important role. And I think many, many Yemenis are desperately hoping that it manages to retain its independence and to retain and pursue its role as a mediator and to maybe be more successful. Oman is credible. It has a credible history of mediation and non-interference in Yemen's affairs. It's neutral, as you've both pointed out very clearly and demonstrated. And as, again, we've said, it has good relations with Iran, but also with the US and UK. And, you know, I mean, despite the tensions, it is still a member of the GCC and has acceptable relations with the Saudis and the coalition in general. So the importance of Oman's ability to resist these pressures and to not be forced to do exactly what is required by its two biggest neighbors is very essential to enable it to keep, you know, to act as a mediator. And this is a position that I think is very much appreciated, I hope, by Britain and by the UN. And certainly we hope that it will be possible to reach some kind of solution. In the long run, and that's on the possibly mistaken assumption that the GCC survives, I think, you know, Oman is one of the few, is the only country that supported the integration of Yemen into the GCC. And one of the reasons I think it's supported, and maybe also one of the reasons why others opposed it, is that between them, Oman and Yemen have certain assets which, if they worked and cooperated together in economy, and certain, particularly in tourism and cultural activities, these things would be beneficial to both of them and very much beneficial to the GCC as a whole, as we said, if it survives. So that would be it. Thank you.
Helen, thank you very much indeed. We struggled to hear you, which is a great pity because it was a really excellent presentation which went into some vital issues. We're going to try and pick up the quality of your sound on the recording that we're making so that people can then access and, if they wish, listen again to your remarks. But picking up from some of what you said and some of the questions we've had, I'd like to put to the other panelists, perhaps Abdullah first, this issue of Oman's financial position, which we heard a lot about in our last webinar, and the fact that there's a lot of speculation that Oman will need to find some sources of finance among or with other GCC states. And to what extent, some people listening today are asking, is that going to colour Oman's ability to act as a neutral party and a facilitator of agreement in the Gulf? And you touched on that quite extensively in your remarks about Yemen, but it would be great to have perspectives from the other panelists on that. Perhaps Abdullah to start with.
Thank you, Richard, and also thank my co-panelists for elaborating on some of those topics, those points. To answer your question, I think this is a question that we face almost every day. You know, would Oman foreign policy change because of its economic woes, as it were? Oman economic challenges have not started today. It's been going on for a while. Started as late as the 2014, if not before. And the situation has been, unfortunately, getting worse, and compounded by, of course, the COVID-19 and the effect of the oil crisis. And I think this is going to continue. Oman is, Sultan Haitham has taken some bold steps in reforming the government and cutting down the costs, etc. Those obviously are going to help to a certain extent, but they're not going to answer the big issue, you know, especially the Oman enormous debt that it has built over the years. So obviously it will need some help, and this is where the question comes. You know, where do Oman turn to? Is it going to be the neighboring countries? And if so, at what cost? Well, I think obviously, Oman would want to turn to the neighboring countries. Although they are actually in a bad situation as it is, almost all of them, but they are still slightly better off than Oman. And the whole idea of the Gulf Cooperation Council is that there is cooperation between these countries, and they do help each other when needed. So Oman can actually, come to or go to the GCC states and see who would want to help. Obviously, there is Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Qatar, and Kuwait in this sense. And I think, any help that comes from these countries would be obviously welcome. Question is at what cost, especially if the funding comes from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in this sense. I don't think, despite what people think, that there's going to be pressure on Oman to change policy. I don't think the fundamentals of Oman foreign policies are going to change. What determines Oman foreign policy is what we've talked about, and that is not something that is, Oman is not a country that's going to suddenly, jump from one camp to the other. I think the fundamentals will stay the same. I think for the neighboring countries, it will be more beneficial if they can understand that Oman's neutral position and Oman's, if you like, the trust that it enjoys with all the different players can be useful to them. They also, I think it's time that our neighbors understand that these conflicts are not going to lead us anywhere except to more challenges and more insecurity and more instability in the region. There is not going to be any hegemonic power in the region. Whether Iran wants to do so, whether Saudi Arabia wants to do so, being the two largest countries, or the aspiring UAE, this is not going to happen. History has told us and has showed us that countries kind of align together against any potential hegemon. So I think the idea of having a regional hegemon should be disbanded altogether, and a new framework, a new paradigm for coexistence and cooperation should be the mode. And if this is the case, I don't think Oman will find any problem. And I think that also neighboring countries are started to know and realize that this is the case. So we have seen that Iran has come up with my friend and colleague Anoush just mentioned the Russian proposal for peace and security in the region. There was also an Iranian proposal, the Hormuz or the Hope, and again, it was talking about more inclusive arrangement, although it has some shortfalls in a sense that it wants to push all the other non-regional powers out, which is impossible at this time. But it's something to build on. So we now have an Iranian proposal, we have a Russian proposal, and there is also, of course, the always ongoing US proposal for peace and security, which is rather exclusive. And I think Oman could play a role in combining all of these. And I think, as it's been mentioned by my colleagues, Oman enjoys that relationship and trust with the Russians, with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the Iranians, and also with the regional powers, despite sometimes, that they want to push Oman in one direction or the other. And I don't think Oman is going to be pushed in either direction. Obviously, there are other routes that Oman could work on, like maybe getting funding from other sources from non-GCC. Kuwait is always an option, which doesn't have any strings attached. Maybe Qatar as well. But I don't think the fundamentals of Oman foreign policy are going to change. Obviously, there's going to be a change in style. We have a new sultan, we will have a new team, and maybe there's going to be a change in the cabinet and the government. But there could be a change in style. But I don't think the basis of Oman foreign policy that I explained in the earlier talk are going to change. We cannot change the geostrategic location. We cannot change the culture of Oman being, want to live in peace with its neighbors, with everybody, and the friendship that it wants to enjoy. That's not going to change. However, maybe there could be some changes in style, but not the content itself, despite the fact that Oman needs the funds from its neighbors.
Thank you very much. That's extremely interesting. I wonder, Anoush, do you have a take on that as well?
I think Abdullah has covered it extremely well, Richard. Merely to say that Oman's foreign policy has never been determined by its economic requirements, and that is why all parties respect its independence of action, if you like. And it's interesting that all have invested in its economic development without making it conditional on its foreign policy. And that is likely to endure if they want to stay involved. I think Oman's strategic location and its political strategy are too important for the neighbors and outside powers to manipulate it in the direction that they want to go for a bit of economic gain. Remember also, Oman has its own sovereign wealth funds that it doesn't want to use, obviously, for economic crisis. But it can call on that. It can go to the IMF if it's really in need of it, which it doesn't want to do at this stage. And I agree with Abdullah. I think he much rather get support from Qatar and from Kuwait, and ideally a collective GCC approach to the economic crisis, because Oman suffers the same way as all GCC countries are now suffering. It much rather see a collective response to this than it being singled out and a country which is being hammered by economic crisis.
Thank you very much. Another question I've got, a couple on Oman's relations with the United Arab Emirates. One mentions possible rivalries over UAE aims in the Horn of Africa, Socotra and Bab el-Mandab. And another one mentions past tensions between Oman and the UAE. I wonder, Abdullah, if you could comment on how you see the outlook for Oman-UAE relations.
Thank you, Richard. I don't think, sometimes neighborly misunderstanding should be overplayed. There are always going to be some misunderstanding, some misperception between regional countries and maybe conflicting policies. Oman and UAE enjoy good relationship in general. And, there are historical links, there are obviously cultural links, there are people's links, we're talking about same families, same tribes, almost, and a shared history. Obviously, as the person who posed the question, there are issues at the moment, and that is maybe because of the United Arab policies, very active foreign policy that the country is undertaking, whether it's in the Horn of Africa, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in general. As you know, the UAE foreign policy at the moment is on steroid, and it's acting everywhere. And obviously, sometimes there are sensitivities about certain actions, and I think what Oman is not a rival to the UAE, or not trying to be a rival, trying to be more of a partner than a rival, and finding ways of cooperation. So it's not trying to rival the UAE presence in the Horn of Africa. I think if there is a country that's doing that, it's probably Qatar rather than Oman. And now we're seeing the Turks are moving there. Oman has obviously some historical links with the Horn of Africa and wants to maintain that link, but it's not necessarily rivaling the United Arab Emirates. However, I think some of the policies of the United Arab Emirates and maybe of Saudi Arabia or the Arab coalition in Yemen is a little bit perplexing when the whole issue, the whole mandate was for them to fight the Houthis in the north, and yet they're moving south to areas where there are of natural interest for Oman, strategic interest, especially in Mahra area and Socotra. And obviously those movements raise some eyebrows in Oman. Why do they want to do that? why do you want to disturb a region that is at peace with itself, especially the Mahra area, the Hadramaut, and of course this is as you know, the Mahra is an area that is shared between Oman and UAE and Yemen, and there are families and tribes that extend between borders. And Oman has invested heavily in that region, try to stabilize it, try to keep it away from all ideologies and fundamentals and ISIS and Qaeda and so on. And Oman doesn't want to see a disturbance in there. And I think Oman, rightly so, is a little bit perturbed with what is going on there and watching what is going there. But I don't think it wants to rival either Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates in that front, although, it questions some of their intentions and moves in Yemen. But in general, I think the relationship has cooled down a little bit. Unfortunately, we say that because, this is the time when, especially with COVID, especially with the challenges the whole region is facing, you want to see more cooperation, more integration, more, support for each other. But yet, what the region really lacks is some kind of a logic that try to, kind of get them to work together. Hopefully, or it was hoped that, COVID would have been the reason for this, but it doesn't seem to be so. And there, of course, there are different policies that have been pursued by these countries. But I don't think they are, Oman sees them as a major challenge, despite the fact that they necessarily doesn't agree with them. Oman never agreed with the war in Yemen, even advised against it in the beginning. And I think, it's time that they can understand that Oman can play a role with this relationship with Yemen, with the different factions in Yemen, its confidence that it has with Iran. It can actually play a role to change the region from what it is to what it should be in the future.
Good.
Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Abdullah. Just, we're nearly up to time, but a quick one for Anoush on China and Oman. China has lent Oman a lot of money, Chinese banks, and has invested in, or said it's going to invest in Duqm. Is there a closer relationship developing there? You mentioned it in the context of possible US concern.
I think both sides want to keep that relationship as close as possible, Richard. But what is interesting is that the Chinese are reaching well into the GCC. And if I were to pick a horse there, I think it'll be the UAE that will be the one that China would want to maintain closest economic links with. But given Dohm's strategic location and what it offers to China, and given the broader interest that China has in Pakistan, in Iran, and also right around the Indian Ocean, it will not relinquish its close ties with Oman. We hear that China capitalizes on vulnerabilities of some of its partners to develop closer political relations with them, but it's done that in countries where there's been much greater strategic vulnerability. Sri Lanka is one example. Myanmar is another example. But I think Beijing recognizes Oman's close links with the West, and it recognizes the strategic importance of Oman, not just to Britain and the United States and so on, but also to its own Asian rival in India. So Chinese are very cautious in how they're treating the relations with Oman and want to be seen as this supporter of Oman, and will continue to I suspect, invest in Dohm and help Oman out of the COVID crisis that it's facing, but probably not go beyond that, because they're still waiting for the dust to settle around COVID and what the Americans will do in the region before they make any further moves, I suspect.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That brings us pretty well up to time. I got a great deal out of all that. And certainly, even though Oman is facing considerable financial difficulties, COVID difficulties right now, it has a new leadership. There seems to be a lot of potential there for Oman to continue playing the constructive role that it's been playing for the last 50 years in the Gulf. And I think that is valued by its major friends and allies outside the Gulf. I hope that in about a month's time, we should be able to have another webinar on Oman and the UK, and that theme we will pursue again then. I want to apologize again for the quality of the sound with Helen, and as I said, we hope we'll pick that up in the recording. Several people are coming through and thanking the panelists, so on their behalf, as we would at Sackville Street, we'll give you a clap, a virtual clap, and thank you all very much indeed for your time. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.